Welcome to this session. We are continuing our series through the book of Galatians. And last time we looked at chapter 1, verse 11 to chapter 2, verse 10, in which Paul told the Galatians why they should follow his gospel and not the false teaching that required the Gentile, that is the non-Jewish men, to be circumcised in order to be saved. He also told them about his conversion and about his trips to Jerusalem. Today we look at chapter 2, verses 11 through to 21. We will go through this passage verse by verse, and I'll make some comments as we do so. So it reads as follows, starting in verse 11. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. Cephas is another name for the apostle Peter. Notice that despite Peter's lofty status as an apostle, Paul wasn't afraid to correct Peter when he was in the wrong. No one is above correction. So what was Peter's error? Well, Paul continues in the next verse. For until certain people came from James, he, that's Peter, used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. Jews considered uncircumcised Gentiles to be spiritually unclean and therefore didn't eat with them. However, the gospel teaches that both Jews and Gentiles are made spiritually clean through faith in Jesus Christ. Peter knew this and would therefore happily eat with the Gentiles, that is, until the circumcision faction came along. The circumcision faction taught that Gentiles had to be circumcised in order to be saved. Peter's fear of this circumcision faction caused him to stop eating with the Gentiles. And the lesson here is that fear makes you a people pleaser instead of an example to others. And so we must resist such fear. Paul continues in verse 13, and the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Peter's bad example encouraged others to do the same. And sin is contagious. We must be careful of the example that we set for others. It continues in verse 14. Paul writes, but when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Peter didn't follow all of the Jewish customs. He knew that in Christ, all of that is unnecessary. It was therefore hypocritical of Peter to separate himself from the Gentiles on the basis that they were not circumcised. Peter was guilty of being a chameleon, which changes its color to blend in with its surroundings. In this, we must challenge ourselves. Do we compromise so that we can blend in with the world, or are we an example to the world? Paul wrote in Romans 12 verse 2, do not be conformed to this world. And in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14, Jesus said, you are the light of the world. So rather than conform to this world, we are to be a shining example of righteousness. In verses 15 to 16 of Galatians 2, Paul continues, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And we have come to believe in Christ Jesus so that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by doing the works of the law, because no one will be justified by the works of the law. Paul's point here is that both Jews and Gentiles are justified only by faith in Jesus and not by keeping the law. To be justified means to be forgiven, acquitted of all sin, placed in right standing with God. The phrase "the law" is short for the law of Moses, and it refers to the hundreds of commandments that God gave to Israel through the ministry of Moses after they left Egypt. And it was in the law of Moses, one of the commandments was that the Israelites were to be circumcised. Now Paul continues in verses 17 to 18. He says, "But if in our effort to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have been found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. But if I build up again the very things that I once tore down, then I demonstrate that I am a transgressor." Now these verses are difficult, but here is how I understand them. The circumcision faction maintained that Gentile believers who did not keep the law of Moses were sinners. As such, for a Jew to believe in Christ and no longer keep the law of Moses would make that Jew a sinner too. But Paul argues that such is not the case. Christ justifies believers by faith without the works of the law. Therefore, being without the works of the law cannot make us sinners, as that would make Christ a promoter of sin. The real transgression is not abandoning the law. Instead, the real transgression is returning to the law's bondage. This is because in Christ, slavery to the law of Moses has been torn down. Therefore, to rebuild slavery to the law is to oppose the work of Christ and to therefore be a transgressor. Now, Paul continues in verse 19 of Galatians 2. He says, "For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God." Before Paul became a Christian, he tried to keep the law of Moses. However, this only resulted in condemnation because he kept failing. Such repeated failure brought Paul to the end of trying to be saved by keeping the law. In other words, Paul died to the law and instead embarked upon a new way of living for God. So he continues in verse 19 and 20, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Through Christ's crucifixion, Paul died to the law. In his new way of living, he is not enslaved to the external law of Moses. Instead, Christ himself now lives in Paul and empowers him to live in a manner that pleases God. Furthermore, in this new way of living, Paul no longer depended on keeping the law to be righteous, but instead knew that he had been justified by faith in Jesus, who loved Paul and died in his place. This new way of living is something that all of us are invited into. This is the Christian way of life. Each of us must know and believe that we are already justified because we believe in Jesus. Notice that Paul said, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." This is something that we should all be able to say. The true Christian is dead and simply wants Christ to live through them. As we live this new life, we must therefore constantly ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? And do accordingly. Are you still alive, or are you letting Christ live through you as you respond to the various situations that you face? Now, let's come to the final verse of our passage, verse 21, where Paul wrote, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if justification comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. When God justifies us, it is an act of his grace. The word grace means free and unmerited favor. Justification is not something we have earned or deserve. It is given to us as a free, unmerited gift. Therefore, to maintain that one has to keep the law of Moses in order to be justified is to deny that salvation is a free gift from God. Furthermore, if we could be justified by keeping the law, then there was no need for Jesus to die. Jesus died for us because we cannot be justified by keeping the law. We have all already failed. But on the cross, Jesus took upon himself the punishment we all deserved, so that we could be saved by God's grace. Therefore, from the word grace, we can make the following acronym: God's riches at Christ's expense. Let us never fall into the trap of thinking that we are saved by our own good deeds. As Paul said in Ephesians 2 verse 8, by grace we are saved through faith. Thank you very much for listening to this video. And if you enjoyed this teaching, please press the like button, which will help this channel. And please also be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you are notified when new videos are added. Thanks again. God bless.